Thank you, Zarni, and to Barbara and to Wolfson College for hosting this really important conference. We're delighted to be here. And as Daniel mentioned, this is the report that we wrote and published last year about fieldwork we conducted in Rakhine State. I'm going to basically make some prefatory remarks to talk a little bit about the research and the methodology, and then I'm going to hand over to Tom, who's going to talk a little bit more about the, our findings. Primarily, I want to make 4 points drawing on this research. Now, the research was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council under their urgency grant system. It was an 18-month study. We had 4 months in the field, and there were 3 researchers. The other researcher is Alicia Delacour-Venning. And I think the question that we set out to explore was the persecution that we had heard of in 2012, was it genocide? Could it be defined as genocide or some other form of very serious persecution? The evidence that we accrued gave us a resounding yes as an answer to that question. The framework that we employed was not a legal one. In fact, the best literature on genocide, I think, makes clear that genocide is a process, a social process, and it's best understood as that rather than a legal construct for a number of reasons. Under international law, the labelling of genocide places certain obligations on states, obligations to prevent and to punish the perpetrators of genocide. And historically, we know that states are extremely reluctant to label persecution as genocide because it does require them to act. And I think that if we wait for a court, an international court of law or an international tribunal to declare or to decide whether or not the persecution that's taking place is in fact genocide, then I think we will have waited far too long. We don't have time to wait for international courts to decide what's happening. And I don't think we can, I think history shows us that we don't have much faith in the international legal processes with regard to genocide. So when we talk about a social process, what do we mean? We have looked at the whole range of genocide literature. The very best of it talks about stages, and in fact it's Daniel Fierstein's work which we have found the most valuable. And Daniel talks about a 6-stage process, and as you see here, the first stage, stigmatization, the second stage, harassment, which is about physical violence primarily, when stigmatization takes on a very physical and ugly form, that of violence. This kind of stigmatization and violence leads, and in the case of the Rohingya in 2012, led to the isolation of the Rohingya population in and around Sittwe into camps. So they were isolated from the rest of the Rakhine State population. And what we found when we did our research in the camps in Ongmingala ghetto and in the villages in the Sittwe and Murau region, we weren't able to get access to northern Rakhine State, but there are a number of people in the audience who have, and I'd be very interested to hear more about what they have to say. But from that field work, from those experiences and our observations, it was clear to us that the Rohingya were at this particular stage of systematic weakening. The Burmese state is involved in the weakening of the Rohingya population, and this is a method, a genocidal, it's a method in the genocide process, that you weaken a community to such an extent that it no longer acts with purpose, that it is excluded from the rest of the society, that the state no longer holds what it sees to be a moral obligation to this group of people. And certainly in terms of the lack of healthcare that we heard about earlier, the very limited food rations that the World Food Programme deliver to the camps, the loss of livelihood, the inability for the Rohingya in Rakhine State to actually lead purposeful lives is removing them from the society in which they were born and grew up. And so the point about the process, and I know we've moved on in terms of the slides, is to say that these are overlapping stages. They don't occur discretely. The stigmatisation still occurs, the isolation is happening, the physical violence is brewing under the surface and erupts periodically. And we are also seeing evidence of the final two stages, which are mass extermination. We saw the violence of 2012, but also in terms of the very final stage, which is the reorganisation of society, a society in which the identity of the Rohingya, in this case, no longer exists. We see evidence of that with the denial of the use of the term Rohingya. You simply can't use the term Rohingya inside Burma. We've had Aung San Suu Kyi declare to the ambassador, the US ambassador, that they're not to use the term Rohingya. This is about denial of identity. So in effect, really, my time is up, so I'm going to pass over to Tom, who's going to talk in more detail about systematic weakening. Thanks.
Thank you, Penny. And yes, just following on, I just wanted to talk briefly about what we witnessed ourselves in the camps, and just to show you some photographs to help imagine what it's like there. As we heard earlier, there is basically no healthcare whatsoever. The humanitarian infrastructure was attacked in March 2014. This was organised attacks against the international organisations that are helping the Rohingya. And this led to the setting up of the Emergency Coordination Centre, the ECC, which is a layer of bureaucracy that was introduced by the Union government to kind of assuage the concerns that led to the attacks against the international organisations, in that the Rakhine Buddhists were being left out of the international aid interventions in the state. The Arakan National Party, we went and talked to them. They're also involved in this systematic weakening. They campaigned on an anti-Rohingya platform and swept to power in the recent elections. And some of the things they said to us were, when the international community give the Rohingya a lot of food, they grow fat and become stronger, and then they will become more violent. They also said, according to 1982 law, people don't have citizenship, should be kept in prison. But there are so many people that we can't keep them in prison. So as an idea, they should have a concentration camps to keep people who don't have citizenship. And then the caveat was added, oh sorry, not concentration camps, detention centres. This was in English, so it wasn't like there was some sort of translation problem. We also saw this poster at the ANP. This is a Arakan Army calendar. And on it we have clearly in English, Defenders of the Fatherland, which is a term that I hadn't seen since research on Nazi Germany. Also the ECC themselves, we interviewed members of the ECC, and they talked about things about not enough space. Lebensraum would be another word for what they were talking about. So if you look at the Rohingya IDP camps, this is an unregistered camp. A lot of people are unregistered by the government, and the UN go by the government's registration status, so that's highly problematic. I just wanted to show you the Rohingya IDP camp just to compare it to, this is the only kind of healthcare we saw. These are unqualified people acting as pharmacists and giving healthcare. We saw this gentleman giving injections without wiping down the arm first and things like this. This is the kind of only thing that people have to do. A lot of kids go around collecting dung and making these fuel. another Rohingya IDP camp in Marau. But what I wanted to show you was the Rakhine IDP camp, because there are Rakhine Buddhists in IDP camps as well, and they're very different. It's one family per household. They're raised off the ground, so you are not subject to the flooding and the heat problems that the Rohingya IDP camps. You can come in and out, and you can see there are lots of businesses going, and it just shows the attitude of those who constructed and run the camps, that there is a segregation between the way people are being treated. The IDP camps, some of the IDPs we talked to in the camps weren't actually IDPs. The people who had lived in the houses had moved home and had rented them out, so that these were generally seen as decent accommodation, the Rakhine IDP camps. Stark contrast to the Rohingya IDP camps, especially the unregistered. And then when you go into Sitwe and walk around, you see burnt out mosques like this one. And also at the background of the systematic weakening is the weakening of the Rohingya as a political force. They're not allowed vote, the disenfranchisement. And this is led by the local civil society protesting against Rohingya right to protest. And these are just some pictures. Supporters of Rohingya are enemies. Médecins Sans Frontières, get out. This is a protest against Ban Ki-moon. This is a protest against Quintana. And you can see his face with an X through it, which I'm sorry to have to show that in front of Thomas Quintana sitting here in the second row. But they don't need your bias suggestion is what the message is, whereas, as we know, Thomas was only trying to bring to light the situation. And just to finally, to absolutely finish, something that people should probably look into is one of the drivers of the moving Rohingya out of their villages is economic development, and this is a map showing where a port is being built on top of where the Rohingya were moved out of. And I'll leave it there, and thank you, and excuse my overgo.
Thank you, Kenyan. Thomas, the next presentation should be done by Dr. Nancy Hudson-Roth, who is an honorary fellow at the Tasmania Asia Institute in Australia, and the presentation is Rohingya Genocide, International Complicity in Burma's Internal Violence. Due to personal reasons, Dr. Nancy Hudson-Roth is not able to be with us, but Professor MacManus will present some excerpts of her presentation.
Yes, and that's a very important caveat. I am not Dr. Nancy Hudson-Roth, but I have agreed to read some of the extracts from her paper because unfortunately she wasn't able to make it here today. I hope that you have seen this paper in the emails from the organisers. If you haven't, please do get in touch and they can send it to you because I'm not going to be reading that much from it. So I'll just read straight a few excerpts that stood out to me as important. At every stage in governments and national development, with the brief exception of pre-military days of the 1960s, the government of Burma has systematically denied providing Rohingya with some kind of recognition, including the right to citizenship. At one point post-independence, the Rohingya claim of separate ethnic identity was recognised by the democratic government of Premier U Nu. This is 1948 to 1958. Subsequent governments denied this and this is completed by the 1982 citizenship law. The entire population of Burma is colour-coded, and after Operation Nagamin, which continued for a decade, almost the whole population of Burma was registered and granted identity cards. The Rohingya were told they did not fall into any category. There has been an organised forgetting of the long reign of terror which various regimes have conducted against the Rohingya since the 60s. The Rohingyas who survived mass attacks of violence in 2012 remaining in Burma are held in detention camps surrounded by fences and guards, denied all basic freedoms necessary for a dignified life. They have no livelihood, they have no land, they have no schooling, they have no voice, they do not appear in the census, and they do not run for elections. Dr. Hudson-Root then goes on to talk about General Ne Win's rule from 1962 to 1988, followed by the SLORC, the SLORK, and you can have a look at that in the paper yourself. There are some detailed points about the different treatment of the Rohingya by those regimes. And also highlighted is the kind of modern version of this, which is international capital investment into Burma since 2010, which is ignoring basically the situation on the ground and is just seeing Rakhine State as an investment opportunity. And this is especially from China and India, but also there are a lot more other companies that have been invited in and are taking resources and using the strategic site of Rakhine State to further international capital. And this is the kind of modern version of the SLORC and the Ne Win years. And I'll just finish with another section. An NLD reconnaissance group touring each state and division met with elected federal and state MPs concerning land confiscation. In reply to my question what Rohingya would be represented in current Rakhine State visit, I was told the group would meet only with elected members, no Rohingya. Given that the Rohingya were denied a vote, how would mass confiscation of their land be addressed, I asked. It's a very touchy issue, I was told. Jo Hla Ong, a lawyer, human rights defender, Rohingya community leader and former staff member of Médecins Sans Frontières, was arrested and jailed in July 2013. He was defending Rohingya men who refused to register as Bengali. He's released under presidential amnesty in 2014. The NLD has ignored the knowledge, expertise and contributions of the Rohingya who have stood the NLD are planning a new democratic nation. They deny the Rohingya recognition or place or hope of survival in the new Burma. The 2012 acts of mass violence against Rohingya were another step of terror by a regime determined to exterminate people simply for who they are. Each year, the lives of Rohingya has been further diminished. The government has succeeded in creating public resentment, animosity and hatred towards Rohingya. In the upside-down world of Burma, the Rohingya who have had their land, livelihood and voices confiscated are accused of overtaking the country. They have been categorized as refugees, smuggled persons, stateless migrants, homeless, persecuted and illegals, but not human beings deserving freedom and dignity and a voice in their own future. And I will leave it at that, and any questions please to Dr. Nancy Hudson-Rudd herself. Thank you.
The last presenter will be Dr. Maung Zarni. I guess he needs no presentation here to this audience, but he is the co-author of, together with Alice Cowley, The Slow Burning Genocide of the Rohingya of Myanmar, published in the Pacific Law and Policy Journal in 2014. And he is the main organizer of this event. Sorry, please.
Thank you very much. I owe an intellectual debt greatly to one of my late mentors. I have two at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The man by the name of Robert Cale, a German-American, born and raised outside of Milwaukee in a small place called Kenosha. He was a student of Talcott Parsons at Harvard, the great sociologist. And during the Second World War, he enlisted and he was posted to Berlin as an MP. And later he became a prison guard for the mid-level and junior level German SS officers. So he was the man who sensitized me to the ideological foundations of mass atrocities and how the perpetrators view their own act. So I approached this issue from 4 different perspectives. One, from a Buddhist epistemological perspective. For a Buddhist, epistemologically, a deed has 3 legs. Mental leg, We call it mano. Verbal act. We articulate. We imagine. We daydream. We fancy harming someone. That's the mental deed in the Buddhist eyes, but not in the eyes of the law until the act was committed. But from a Buddhist perspective, mental act is committed before either orally, following it up, or physically executing the thought of harming a person, an animal, a community of humans. So the second perspective I adopt is personal. It is personal because not as a generic Buddhist person, but as someone whose family friends, childhood friends, and university friends were personally involved at all levels of genocide, from drafting the 1982 citizenship law to serving as the security chief to being founders of Nasaka, which is, I would say, retrospectively, the Burmese equivalent of Gestapo for the Rohingyas. So in that sense, this is not simply a sociological question. It is an existential and personal question. My friends and my family friends were involved, even my teachers, in the execution, planning, designing, and denying. Yeah? Denial is part of genocide. Thirdly, in the sociological framework, the foundational act is what Daniel called stigmatization. But what I call, agreeing with him in spirit, the creating or constructing an existential enemy. Yeah? Why do Buddhists kill? No, Buddhists do not kill. Buddhists eliminate the existential threat. See, that is how they do mental acrobatic. They do not think that they are guilty in their own Buddhist framework because although they are the attackers, they are defending themselves, defending against the existential threat. See, that is something that is crucial to understand. How perpetrators process their evil deeds. And then finally, the fourth perspective will be historical perspective. Everything has a history. Everything is rooted in the past and the time. So I'm going to run through some slides, but those four things are my main points. As a whole, the Burmese military leaders, I would say since the early 1970s, or even like earlier, have always felt demographic existential threat to Burma because we are sandwiched between two giant neighbors, India and China. And then after the War of Independence in Bangladesh, East Pakistan became Bangladesh. There was an influx of Hindu Bengali. Yeah? Remember, Hindu Bengali were the ones who were subject to the genocidal act by West Pakistani army. One of the generals from West Pakistan said, "I don't care about the people, I want the land. So do what you will with the people." And so Hindu Bangladeshis or Bengali from East Bengal were running across the porous border into Burma. But they returned after a Bangladeshi war. And but we are using the narrative to go after Muslim Rohingyas. Yeah? There's a crucial difference here. There are different types of Bengalis. So at the national level, in terms of narrative, we are faced with the demographic threat from neighbors. And then this is the Indo-Burma Immigration Agreement. And the quote from Gandhi was like, "This is so unfair." we were asked to do our own nasty jobs to Burmese and to Indians. That was on the eve of Indian independence in 1947. And in those days, in the colonial assemblies in India and Burma, there were debates about who were, basically, what are we going to do with the mixed races? Yeah? And the people in those days, like the borders are going to be drawn, and there was a question of who was going to go where and who's going to become which part of the newly independent countries. And now, personal. I've worked with this gentleman, ex-General Kinyon, in 2003 until his downfall in 2004. And I worked with him openly after declaring that the policy that Aung San Suu Kyi endorsed and the whole Western world supported, which was essentially political, diplomatic, cultural isolation of Burma and economic sanctions bit. But what I worried more was the political and cultural isolation of a country. You don't help democratize a country by isolating it from the world community. So I openly broke ranks with the entire Burmese opposition to work with this man without knowing what he was doing. And I did not come to the realization what we were doing to the Rohingyas, a few years after my cooperation with him. Yeah? And see, look at here, what I want to show in the next few slides is Buddhist Sangha, or the order, and all the available state and, in quote, civil society institutions were mobilized by the military-controlled state. Here's the thing. Just simply because different communities hold prejudices towards others who are different do not automatically trigger a genocidal act. There has to be a mobilization. Yeah? That mobilization, in the case of Burma, is done most centrally by the state. And the state, the military leaders, they co-opt and they mobilize the racial and religious prejudices that exist and pervade within the Burmese Sangha. So, okay, 1 minute? 1 minute. Okay. There is a racist element. The issue of Rohingya has been framed as a demographic explosion. Yeah? The Muslims procreate like rabbits. That's a myth that the Burmese have created, and that's a myth that is extremely effective. The Islam allows 4 wives, and that one family would have like 80 children. Yeah, and yet the Burmese military wanted to increase the population up to 100 million to withstand the population pressure from neighboring countries. Yeah, and so what they were motivated by was not the demographic issue. That was a race issue or religion issue. Here you see a truckload of Bangladeshi-born Rakhine Buddhists coming openly to the Burmese side, the Burmese authorities and others providing everything, yeah? While we were attempting to eliminate the Muslim population that have been there for centuries or generations. And the Burmese also approved 60,000 ethnic Han Chinese and named them a new ethnic identity while attempting to erase the Rohingya identity from Aung San Suu Kyi down to the streets level. So finally, these are the organs that the state has mobilized, the media, the social forces, and then this point is so important, and I'll stop there. Over the last 55 years or 60 years, the population ratio in Arakan state between the Muslims and the Buddhist Rakhines have remained relatively very stable. Yeah? And yet, the population is fed with this manufactured and blatant lie to justify framing, constructing the Rohingyas in particular, and Muslims in general, as an existential threat to the Burmese way of life, the Burmese population. We are not killing human beings as far as the perpetrators are concerned. We are eliminating the existential threat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charlie. So now we have a 15 minutes session for questions and answers. Please introduce yourselves before asking.
Hi there. My name is Francis Wade. I'm a journalist. Question for Zarni: can you expand a bit more on how the process of the three deeds kind of playing out helps Buddhists to justify the use of violence in the name of defense? So it seems that the narrative is that Buddhism is pitched strongly against the use of violence. Are there sort of texts or passages in the scriptures that really sort of rationalise it and justify it in that sense of defence?
Yeah, I mean, like in any other philosophical doctrine, the idea of self-defense is so ingrained in the Buddhist thought, as well as you've got in the Christian ethics like a just war doctrine, yeah. And then in Islam, the same thing. I'm not trying to justify what the Buddhists are doing, far from it. But what I'm saying is that there are textual bases for basically taking lives, killing and harming people. And the one episode, I have actually posed this question in my lowest moments, like thinking that the Burmese military the generals need to be eliminated rather than negotiated with. I posed this question to two of the most prominent Burmese monks. One passed away at 94 a few months ago in San Jose when I was studying with him for a few weeks, and in California. And he said, and then also one other Theravada Buddhist monk who did his doctorate in Sri Lanka on Buddhist studies. They both said it is the intention that matters. If you're not harming people with hatred or prejudices, but to save, they make an exception. And give an example. If there's a madman on a lifeboat, and you have children, women, pregnant ladies, and elderly people on a lifeboat. There's a madman that cannot be constrained by any other means. In order to save the entire people on the lifeboat, that madman needs to be restrained. If that nothing works, he needs to be thrown off the boat. Yeah, and that. But of course the question is, who is to decide which situation grants taking this exceptional action? And so I would not seek, scriptural justification, but a lot of monks have been going that route.
Thank you so much. Question for Penny. Question for Penny. My name is Azim Ibrahim. I'm a fellow at Mansfield College here at Oxford. As we come to realise, the government of Myanmar is very sensitive over the use of the term Rohingya. Just wondering, what was the reaction to your report, and was there any comeback from the government or anybody else? And how did you counter that?
The only response that I think we identified was a small article in the New Light of Myanmar, the government's mouthpiece, which talked about, I don't know if it identified us specifically, but talked about the notion of the use of a fabricated term, a made-up term, that we had somehow been investigating something that didn't exist. So we haven't had any immediate response from the government.
Yes, certainly. Well, that was a quite provocative title, you know, why Buddhists kill. I don't think that kind of title helps for the discussion, to be honest, and I wanted to just put it here in the auditorium. I have interviewed monks in jail who were demonstrating against the regime during the Saffron Revolution in 2007. So to put it in, I understand your point, it's provocative, and I understand that the authorities of the Buddhist authorities, the Sangha that I mentioned, might also have a responsibility on this, but I'm not sure to what extent this helps for discussion. Just.
I mean, I chose that not necessarily to provoke or to be provocative. I chose that because there is a tendency that will be known as Orientalist tendency within the Western imagination, that Islam is violent, extremist, oppressive towards women and everybody else, and Buddhism is the entire opposite of Islam. Yeah? So the West has embraced this faulty, empirically faulty assumption that Buddhism is all about non-violence, loving kindness, and compassion. But if you go anywhere in reality and in practice, we must not make the distinctions between here's a real Buddhism and here is the Buddhism in practice. Yeah, there's a danger. I understand, there are a lot of monks who are unhappy with what their fellow monks are doing, but at the same time, the idea of presenting the word Buddhist without quotation marks is to confront that commonsensical, notion, which is completely anti-empirical. Buddhism has always been, like any other religion, rooted in political economy and society, as violent, as vile and evil, as well as noble and high-minded as other religions. So my point is to confront and challenge this Orientalist understanding of Buddhism and Buddhist community. And we are no different. We cannot make ourselves any special or exceptional vis-a-vis the rest of philosophical communities.
Hello everyone. For people who weren't here at the beginning, my name is Barbara Harris-White and I coordinate the South Asia Research hosting the conference. I have 3 questions. The first is to Penny and perhaps also to Daniel. You said that you weren't going to take a legalist framework for your research, and the Genocide Studies reader suggests that although the UN framework has its flaws, it's the only one around which people will agree. So for your own research, you take a different framework, knowing that people may not necessarily agree. So I would like you to reflect on the difference between the framework you took and the UN framework. The second question is one of factual information to Tom. You talked about Rakhine Buddhists in IDP camps, and to this hour of the day's proceedings, I haven't actually heard that Buddhists were in IDP camps. Are they displaced because of conflict or because of development displacement? And the third is a kind of subaltern question. When research is done on the conditions of the Rohingyas, necessarily people carry out this research with a framework. And the framework defines livelihoods in a particular way. But I would like the whole panel to reflect on how people do eke out livelihoods in the informal economy. Do they educate their children informally? Do they not educate their children at all? Are
the difference between using a legal versus a social process framework. I mean, we're criminologists primarily, so we come out of a social scientific tradition. And I think the reason that we adopt a social process, it's not only a social process definition, we combine it with a state crime framework, state crime paradigm, which understands, which puts in the dock states very, very firmly as perpetrators and not necessarily protectors, which the law often fails to do. I think that the value of a social process approach is that it's far more nuanced. And so you can understand, the law doesn't allow us to understand genocide as a process which might take decades. We can identify genocide taking place, and the genocide that's taking place against the Rohingya has been decades long, as Zarni and his colleague have demonstrated. And when, in fact, we visited Murau, we learned from our interviews that the town centre of Murau, which is some distance from Sittwe towards the sort of northeast, that the town centre had gradually been denuded of its Muslim businesses, its Muslim commercial sites and its Muslim population, so that now Murau, there are no Muslim businesses and there are no Muslims living in the town. They are in isolated villages or in camps. And so a process approach to understanding genocide and a stages approach allows us to identify early stages, which actually allows us to identify points of intervention, if we so choose. And the law is a far more clumsy instrument, I think, and in fact, we now have the British government saying that before we did our research, or the British government said, well, we can't, at the Foreign Commonwealth Office, we can't define what's happening in Rakhine State as genocide until we have an evidence base. So we said, okay, we'll go out and we'll do this research, and we produced an evidence base. But then the minister comes back and says, well, actually, we can't have genocide until a court of law determines it as such. And how long will we have to wait for a court of law to determine it as such? And so I think that understanding it as a process, understanding in terms of stages, the stages that we outlined that Daniel has so brilliantly articulated, allows us, and they're overlapping, of course, but it allows us to understand what's happening from a very early stage, to start building campaigns, to start intervening, to start putting pressure, and whatever form that pressure might take is up for debate, clearly. But I think that the social process definition is far more nuanced, allows us to understand what actually genocide is. Because the law doesn't talk about the final stage, in fact, that Daniel so carefully articulates, and that's this reorganisation of collective identities, which is the ultimate purpose of genocide, to remove from the kind of the history of a region, the very identity that it has sought to eliminate. And so history is reconstructed and rewritten, not only for those who remain in Burma, let's say, but also for the Rohingya, who have become a fragmented diaspora, who have no homeland in order to reconstruct or to reimagine their culture. So I think they're the reasons primarily, and as a social scientist and not as a lawyer, though Tom is a lawyer, but we're much more persuaded by a social scientific approach to genocide than a legal approach. I hope that answers that question.
Yes, just a nuance, because I was talking with Penny that it is not contradictory at all with the legal definition. So beyond the gaps of the legal definition, I think it is a question of interpretation of the Genocide Convention. And we have done it in different trials in different parts of the world, particularly in Argentina, but not only. Also, it is included in the process of the Bangladeshi trials now, and it was also confirmed by the Constitutional Court in Colombia in 2 cases, that you can interpret the Genocide Convention as it is in different levels and in different views, and the sociological understanding of genocide gives you more historical elements to analyze the convention, because otherwise the law is something abstract that doesn't exist in reality. example, to think that you could have a genocide without political reasons is non-historical. Non-genocide in history was done without political reasons, but it is not a question of I would say, contradicting the convention. It is just different ways of interpret the convention, but I will talk about it in my presentation.
And I think too that if you go back to Lemkin, who coined the term, I mean, he is far more nuanced than most legal scholars are about genocide.
We have only 2 minutes
Sorry,
for Thomas and Zarni, so...
Yeah, and the question about other ethnicities in camps, we talked to at least 5 ethnicities. There are about 200,000 people around Sittwe in IDP camps. We don't know how many actually, and no one can give you the number. The vast majority are Rohingya, about 150,000. Then there are Kaman, who are also Muslim, but they do have citizenship, but they can't leave their camps for fear of being treated as Rohingya. There are also Miramaji, who are Buddhist, but they speak a more Rohingya-related language, so they can leave their camp, but again they are attacked now and again. And there are also Hindus who completely keep their heads down and say they are Muslims or whatever if you ask them. And inside the major regions of the camp complex, there are markets, a small market. There is a small fishing port because the vast majority of fishermen had been Rohingya before the violence. And in the market you will see people buying gold, you will see people selling aid, which the WFP are aware of and are happy for people to choose their own way to use the food. But the point is they cannot access the market. So these markets inside are run on illicit, it is entrepreneurial Rakhine Buddhists who are going into the camps with food from the main market and adding on extra cost, because it is a danger to them if they're seen going in by other Rakhine around the entrance to the camps, then they are themselves in danger. So there are informal economies. It's low enough level, and most people have absolutely no access to jobs. There are also some primary schools, but no Muslim or Rohingya especially are allowed to sit any of the state exams. So there's only so far that the students can go anyway.
Just 2 very brief points. One is on the use of genocide convention, because that's what most everybody immediately think of. And the Cambodian Khmer Rouge genocide ended in January 1979, and that's how many years ago? Almost 40 years ago. And I am with the Cambodian Documentation Center, so I occasionally go to important proceedings, like in the ECCC, the International Hybrid Tribunal in Phnom Penh. And in this 8th year of running this tribunal, has the court begun to entertain the question of genocide? Almost 40 years after the genocide that took place, whereby almost 2 million people perished. And they're beginning to consider this question in the 8th running year and after almost 40 years of the events. And the second one on the livelihoods. The camps are only 1/10 of the entire population of Rohingyas, and the rest are in hundreds of the patchwork of villages and towns. And there are spaces where the local authorities and security units essentially negotiate with the members of the Rohingya communities, fishermen and whatnot. And so in that scenario, not to be exploited and not to be forced to pay bribes is the most terrible, it would be a tragedy. Because one concrete example, when their freedom of movements, physical movements are restricted, that restriction has an economic value. The guards can extract the money so that I can go and work in a different village and walk across to the Bangladeshi border, and or like a fish. And then Dan, my security officer, would sell what I have acquired for that day before I arrived back to my village, and he would just simply send the buyer to my house and say, the officer so-and-so said, I must get like 2 kilograms of fish today. That's how it's working. So I'll stop.
Okay, thank you. And just being in Oxford, let me give you a recommendation connected with your question, Barbara. The Oxford Handbook of Genocide is interesting because it's a very open view published in English about different interpretation and perspectives on genocide studies, just referring to these different possibilities of interpretation and different scholars working in different parts of the world. So this is the finish of the session. We're 5 minutes over, so we are finished here. Please let me ask a strong applause for the great panel.